Studying measure for measure and keen to get a more detailed insight into the nuts and bolts of Act 5, Scene 1, you're in the right place. Just make sure that you've read and thought about this scene before watching this video. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
Time for my summary of this whopping final scene, and I will try to be concise as well as giving some useful lesser known details. The Duke is back. He piles ceremonious formal thanks on Angelo and Aeschylus for managing Vienna so well in his absence. Cue immediate suspicious thoughts from the audience. What is he up to? Next, Isabella is cued by Friar Peter to launch her savage denunciation of Angelo. However, without any build-up or initial explanation, her desperate-sounding repetitions of justice and descriptions of Angelo as a devil result in her being called mad, a common historical tactic used by men keen to silence uncomfortable truths uttered by a woman. Isabella gets more and more worked up, resulting in the Duke apparently concurring with Angelo's initial assessment of her poor mental state and calling for her to be sent away. However, when she moves from melodramatic, insult-laden rhetorical questions to calmer, logical, sequential arguments, the Duke's position begins to shift slightly. Perhaps he is now safe to suggest that this woman may not be barking after all and should at least be listened to. Of course, as is traditional in a Shakespearean final scene, there are a number of people on stage, including those especially summoned by the Duke and referenced in Act 5, Scene 5, such as Varius, who responded so rapidly to the summoning. But of particular interest to the audience is Lucio, who, given the slightest prompt, eagerly tries to get involved in the conversation, confirming that he was indeed sent to enlist Isabella's help by Claudio. The Duke, unsurprisingly giving Lucio's references to him in both Act 3, Scene 2 and more briefly in Act 4, Scene 3, snaps at and tries to silence him as quickly as possible, which, of course, isn't easy. Isabella's problem, it would appear, in this part of the scene is her inability to avoid using accusatory and inflammatory language when referring to Angelo. He is a pernicious caitiff, an insidiously dangerous wretch, and this type of language jars within this male-dominated, initially apparently celebratory and complacent inner circle. The Duke once again rebukes Isabella for inappropriate, crazy-sounding language, but 100 lines into the scene, she finally gets to the point and reveals Angelo's bribery plot, her lovely body in exchange for Claudio's life. The trouble is that actually both sides didn't keep to their side of the sickening bargain. The audience and the Duke, of course, know that it was Mariana's body, whilst Angelo pressed ahead with Claudio's execution anyway. The Duke reacts as you would expect a Duke to react who has been away for a period of time with a highly respected and trusted deputy in his place. He scoffs, he scorns, and suggests that such an idea is preposterous. 2 reasons: Angelo's unblemished reputation and the illogical hypocrisy of sentencing someone to death for fornication whilst partaking yourself. He then declares dramatically that someone must have put Isabella up to this outrageous plan. We, the audience, know that it is the Duke himself, whilst disguised as the friar, and so can't help but marvel at his own apparent need to remain the central focal point of any dramatic scene. Astonishingly, Isabella is placed under guard and orders are given for her to be whisked off to prison. At this point in the scene, the Duke seems keen to emphasise his unconditional support to his apparently faithful, selfless deputy, who wisely chooses to say very little, although the audience will be fascinated to see his reactions and body language whilst being accused. He continues to pursue his line of reasoning that Isabella must have been put up by someone else to behave as she did, and finds out that a Friar Lodowick has been involved, i.e. himself, of course. Lucio intervenes once more and amusingly flips his exchanges with Friar Lodowick by claiming that this naughty friar had made a series of disparaging comments about the Duke. But Friar Peter, who is in on the plan, having been given instructions about it in Act 4, Scene 5, comes to the defence of Friar Lodowick, but adds that he can't come at this present moment to defend himself due to illness, a strange fever. The Duke professes incredulity at the apparent trustworthiness of this friar, and by extension, continued disbelief in the possibility of Angelo being guilty, before declaring that he will remain impartial in the whole business, and that Angelo should judge his own case himself. Presumably right on cue, Mariana then enters, veiled. Following some misogynistic for a modern palate questioning about her status in relation to men, Mariana continues to equivocate about who she is, and Lucio continues to look for opportunities to interject and joke. However, eventually, she claims that her effective husband is Angelo, and that it was she who slept with him on that fateful night, not Isabella. Angelo then goes on to the attack. He admits that 5 years ago he was engaged to Mariana, but that he had to break it off due to her failure to provide the dowry as agreed, and, even more damagingly, because she was believed to be sleeping with other men. Mariana has the good sense and dignity not to respond to this, but simply repeats that she is effectively Angelo's wife. This angers Angelo, who seizes onto the Duke's idea that the women have been put up to this by a behind-the-scenes, conniving, dastardly friar. He wants to get to the bottom of the whole business, and is determined to question this friar, irrespective of any strange fevers he may conveniently be experiencing. The Duke agrees that Angelo should investigate and judge the whole business before heading off to get changed back into his disguise as the friar. There does appear to be a general feeling on stage that this Friar Lodowick must have been up to no good, something which Lucio is all too willing to confirm to Aeschylus. And so when he appears on stage, Aeschylus seems uncharacteristically quick to judge and condemn Friar Lodowick, even calling for this meddling friar to be tortured. Unsurprisingly, the Duke is not keen on this, and claims that he is not a citizen and so not subject to the laws in Vienna. He is simply there observing the stench of corruption in high places. Outraged, Aeschylus calls for him to be sent to prison, with the case against him being made stronger following Lucio's outrageous lies. This friar repeatedly slandered the Duke in a treasonable manner. But there is a scuffle as a supposed friar is led off to prison. Lucio pulls off the Duke's disguise, resulting in, presumably, collective oohs, ahs and gasps from the characters on stage. The Duke doesn't seem too fazed by this, and instead calmly resumes authority. After forgiving Aeschylus, he finally confronts Angelo, who, caught red-handed, simply asks that he should be sentenced straight away for what he has done, to death. But the Duke has other plans. He orders Angelo to marry Mariana straight away before returning to him. Newly unveiled, the Duke probably quite rightly realises that he has some explaining to do to Isabella. As the Duke, why did he permit Angelo to go ahead and sentence her brother to death, knowing him to be an arrant hypocrite? His excuse is somewhat unconvincing. The whole process happened so much quicker than he had anticipated, horribly wrong-footing him. Anyway, Isabella at least professes acceptance of what has happened. Angelo and Mariana have been married and have consummated their marriage in record time. Hurrah! In his most famous speech of the play, the Duke declares that now Mariana's reputation has been restored, Angelo must die for having Claudio sentenced, and Angelo for Claudio, death for death, and measure still for measure. But Mariana is horrified and enlists Isabella's help in pleading for Angelo's life. The Duke then temporarily switches his scattergun attention to the provost and dramatically apparently sacks him for not following protocols when executing Claudio. The provost, who of course knows that Claudio is alive and therefore that the Duke doesn't mean what he is saying, apologises, but says that he has kept someone else alive, Barnardine. This splendid degenerate is duly fetched, along with another masked prisoner. The Duke then, bizarrely, pardons Barnardine before the other prisoner is revealed to be Claudio, and alive. The scene then gallops on apace until its famously ambivalent conclusion. First, the Duke proposes marriage to Isabella, no verbal reply. Then he pardons Angelo and instructs him to love his wife. Next, his attention is turned to Lucio, who is initially sentenced to whipping and death, before this is reduced, perhaps inverted commas, to marrying the prostitute he impregnated. Lucio is mortified, but will live. The play ends with the Duke's second proposal to Isabella, which once again receives no verbal reply. Phew. Here are some questions for you to consider. I'd recommend pausing the video in a moment to write some detailed paragraphs or essay-style responses of your own before continuing the video to consider my ideas and possibly add to your previous answer. So grab your pen, press pause. This video will resume in 5 seconds' time.
A play in which power is invariably misused. To what extent do you agree with this view in relation to Act 5, Scene 1? My initial instinctive response to this is that the adverb invariably may be unfair. If we accept that power is regularly misused in the play and in Act 5, Scene 1, is this always the case? Is it quite that depressing? For instance, is Aeschylus's humane treatment of Pompey, Froth and Elbow an abuse of his power in Act 2, Scene 1? In the same scene, is Elbow misusing his power by bringing those blatant sinning shaggers, Froth and Pompey, to be judged by a higher authority? Or am I just conveniently picking out the more minor characters and ignoring the fact that both Angelo and the Duke are highly irresponsible authority figures? And even the phrase that power is misused needs to be scrutinised. Could there be an argument that the end products justify the Duke's machinations? A contrite, respectively married Angelo, a Lucio triumphantly silenced and made to take responsibility for his past, and an Isabella, feminists get ready, belatedly brought to realise that human procreation within the sacred institution of marriage may be more natural than excessive masochistic desire for God.
Within Act 5, Scene 1, the audience certainly feels uncomfortable with the role the all-knowing, all-powerful Duke plays in relation to Isabel's suit towards the beginning of the scene. He repeatedly professes that Angelo should be the one to deliver justice, in spite of the fact that A, he is the Duke, and so he should be the one making key decisions, and B, this will result in a clear conflict of interest. How can Angelo pass neutral judgment when he himself is accused of committing the crime? The phrase, "be you judge of your own cause," is preposterous. How can a fair result be delivered when the accused is also the judge? The Duke's offer to be impartial, aimed at showing unflinching loyalty and faith in his right-hand man, if taken at face value, is simply a limp, misguided abdication of authority, with echoes of his decision in Act 1, Scene 1 to delegate the task of cleaning up the cesspit of Vienna to the same man. But of course we know that the Duke's words must not be taken at face value. We know that he is playing a waiting game. We know that beneath lavish opening of scene compliments must lie a desire to ensnare, to catch, to entangle. The Duke's surprise and anger at Angelo's hypocrisy has been made repeatedly clear, notably during his soliloquy at the end of Act 3, when he lambasted Angelo's cruelty in sentencing Claudio to death for fornication whilst planning a spot of fornication himself. So could there be a counter-argument that actually the Duke uses his power responsibly in this scene to unequivocally and dramatically hammer home to Angelo and the whole of Vienna that hypocrisy and corruption are wrong and will not be tolerated from anyone? Certainly, when the Duke finally directly confronts Angelo with his crimes, and note that this moment was actually brought forward by Lucio, who naughtily pulled off his friar's hood, there are no denials or pleas for mitigating circumstances. Angelo's confession is absolute. He claims that he would feel even more guilty than he does at the moment, which is pretty difficult given his use of the abstract noun guiltiness to describe himself, which implies that his own identity has become of secondary importance, if he continued to have any thoughts of his crime going undetected, being undiscernible, now that he has found out that his divine-like Duke has been witness to every sordid step. Note his use of polyptoton, his repetition of words derived from the same roots, which implicitly hammers home his own acceptance that the game is up and he is willing to die for what he has done. So to return to the question, in relation to Angelo, yes, the Duke is devious and manipulative, but ultimately his own deception can possibly be justified as he is deceiving someone who has quite patently attempted to misuse his power. In relation to Angelo, the Duke is probably right to take advantage of the knowledge acquired during his time disguised as a friar to spin a trap for his deputy. The whole of Vienna will gasp and sign agreements as Aeschylus marvels at Angelo's fall. The moral can be taken and the slightly devious route to get there forgotten. But in relation to Isabella, it is a wholly different story, isn't it? For whereas Angelo misuses the power he has, Isabella loses all agency following her involvement with the Duke. Let's look at this more closely. It's difficult to forget, or indeed forgive, the Duke's preposterous lie, misuse of power from Act 4, Scene 3, in which he falsely claims that Claudio's death sentence had taken place, in spite of Angelo's previous claim that he would spare him in exchange for sex. But of course the Duke's lie, this misuse of knowledge, pales in comparison with the greater misuse of power which Angelo believes he has perpetuated. Whilst disguised as a friar, the Duke's public power is temporarily on hold. He can simply store up information which can influence his actions and decisions when he resumes authority later on, most notably with reference to Lucio.
But is there something more insidious about the power acquired by the Duke's disguise for the majority of the play, which puts him in a terrifyingly unassailable position when he publicly returns to Vienna in Act 5, Scene 1? Let's again compare him to Angelo. Angelo acquires power, abuses it, and is punished. The Duke temporarily gives up his power, but then gains a different type of power by eavesdropping and putting himself among his people to observe and ponder. He says his motives are pure.
He wants Vienna cleared up, and also to see the effect of power on his previously austere deputy. But many audience members will find it difficult to trust or warm to someone who seems to withhold information unnecessarily for his own benefit. And to return to Isabella, who suffers through the Duke's decision to lie to her about Claudio's death in Act 4, Scene 3, the screenshot is from this scene and contains her notable vow to pluck out Angelo's eyes and his insistence on playing the role of a deeply sceptical judge in this scene. What of her? Is it acceptable in this scene for the Duke to spin out and spin out again Angelo's denouement, which causes Isabella such distress? Here she is left to plead to the one figure she knows she can trust, God, to deliver justice, and over time uncover the evil submerged within respectable, proper facial expressions. And while she is pleading, the audience is likely to be thinking, why hasn't the Duke yet done this? Of course, it makes for splendid drama on stage as we continue to enjoy watching Angelo, knowing that at some point he's going to get his comeuppance. But to return to the question, it does seem rather like a misuse of power. The Duke has the power of knowing everything following his disguise as Friar Lodowick, and here he has the power to dispense justice as the Duke. So why doesn't he get on with it? And in relation to the words on screen, it is notable that the Duke's closing words to Isabella, his 2 marriage proposals, will, if he is accepted, dilute her previously all-encompassing relationship with God and effectively get her into bed with him as quickly as possible. They seem to come out of the blue, and the audience can't help thinking that perhaps the Duke and Angelo aren't that different after all. Perhaps the only difference is that the Duke has been far more cunning than his deputy. Who in their right mind would want to, or feel able to turn down the marriage proposal of the most powerful man in Vienna? Hence Isabella's silence, and these reactions in certain productions. In the Globe 2015 production, Isabella stretches out a conciliatory, emotional hand to the Duke as the play finishes with the traditional Globe dance. Has this Isabella been on a journey, to use a dreadfully hackneyed reality TV phrase? Is this a woman who has experienced a little of what the world has to offer and is now far too mature and emotionally intelligent to want a more strict restraint than that offered by the votaress of St. Clair? And to return to this question, could this mean that we see the Duke's marriage proposals not as an opportunistic abuse of power, not a, ha, Angelo, you wanted her but I got her, but as a kind, loving gesture to someone who is most probably below him socially? I rather like Tyrone Guthrie's presumably dated to modern palate interpretation of the Duke within his programme notes for a 1966 production at Bristol's Old Vic. I suspect he is meant to be something more than a glorified portrait of royalty. Rather, he is a figure of Almighty God, a stern and crafty father to Angelo, a stern but kind father to Claudio, an elder brother to the Provost, and to Isabella, first a loving father, and eventually the heavenly bridegroom to whom at the beginning of the play she was betrothed. But perhaps the key phrase here is meant to be. We can speculate as much as we like about Shakespeare's intentions, but for the vast part we will be guessing, and anyway, the play becomes live as soon as it is performed in front of us. In many ways, it doesn't really matter what a character was originally meant to be. It is how he or she appears within the context of the modern stage and modern preoccupations. And so for many of us, rather than some weird father-daughter to holy bride evolution, we feel more comfortable with what happens in David Thacker's 1994 production. The credits start rolling with a reassuring COVID-friendly 2+ metre social distance between the old perv and Isabella. We don't know what is going to happen, but certainly this girl is not going to immediately cave in and marry someone who has manipulated her so shamelessly for the majority of the play. A reference to a second critical interpretation would be apt here. This quotation comes from the notes from the RSC edition of the play and certainly implies an abuse of power both from Angelo and the Duke. Certainly seeing the Duke and Isabella close together makes my flesh crawl. What must the age difference be? 20 years?
The pardoning of Angelo at the play's end is shocking. To what extent do you agree with this view? I've got to say, and come out with this straight away, I don't agree with this at all. Here's why.
His wife, the woman, remember, he abandoned and completely forgot about for 5 years, wants him to be given a second chance and is desperate for him to live. She is the one who has been humiliated and hurt the most by him. Isabella never had to go through with the shady, late-night liaison, whilst Claudio himself recognised to some extent the justice of his sentence for fornication. And frankly, in a play in which women are given precious little agency, it is both reassuring and unbelievable to come across a case in which a woman has been listened to in a fairly straightforward manner. And indeed, there is plenty of sense in what she says. None of us are perfect, and we can all potentially learn from past errors. And whereas the 1994 Thacker production makes it unclear as to whether the Duke and Isabella will become a happy couple, there are fewer doubts when it comes to Angelo and Mariana. The sharing of eye contact, the clasped hands, and above all, Mariana's steadfast, unwavering love against all the odds. Yes, this is a relationship which might work, and if the murderer Barnardine can be pardoned without doing a bloody thing, then surely Mariana deserves her plea for Angelo to be pardoned to be granted. Why else do I disagree so violently with the idea that Angelo's pardoning is shocking? Well, as partly alluded to in reference to Barnardine, pardoning is just what happens in the final scene to everyone. After his disguise as Friar Lodowick is uncovered, the Duke pardons Aeschylus for his furious tirade against his alter ego. After pardoning Barnardine, the Duke then pardons Claudio, although given his subsequent marriage proposal within the same sentence, the audience may well be tempted to think there could be some implicit emotional blackmail at play here. I've pardoned your brother, so you better bloody marry me now. Even Lucio gets let off whipping and hanging, and this is the man about he previously vowed. And yet here's one in place I cannot pardon. Although nowadays the play is termed a problem play, it does share with more conventional comedies a degree of resolution at the end, plenty of marriages, and the potential for happy endings for many of the characters. So, in order for there to be a happy-ish ending, we need Angelo to be pardoned, and if Isabella can forgive him, then surely the Duke can do likewise. One final point on this question. When kneeling to plea for Angelo's life, what a turn on that is likely to have been for the twisted Duke, Isabella made reference to Angelo's character. I partly think a due sincerity governed his deeds till he did look on me. Since it is so, let him not die. She isn't completely sure, but feels that Angelo was a consistent man, a man with firm, albeit somewhat rigid beliefs in justice and what was right and wrong, until he met her. People may not have always agreed with him, but they couldn't help respect and admire his steadfastness. So, Angelo was corrupted by one person, something for which he was genuinely repentant when exposed. When we think of Measure for Measure as a whole, it is surely right that the more straightforward deceivers can be pardoned. After all, How would we as an audience have reacted, seeing the Duke not only manoeuvring his way to bedding a nun and being viewed by Vienna as the all-conquering, all-wonderful returning hero, but also leaving a trail of hypocritical destruction in his wake? That would surely have been too much to swallow.
So we've come to the end of these series of videos on every scene within Measure for Measure. Remember, the key to writing a good essay is knowing the play incredibly well. Each video has included a series of quotations on screen, along with my own ideas. How many of these have you jotted down? How many pages of notes have you produced independently, thinking about key characters and themes? As well as reading the play numerous times, to what extent have you devoured critical viewpoints and considered a range of productions? Good luck with it all, and many thanks for watching Schofield on Shakespeare.